Hello, welcome to the Art Channel. Today, Joshua and myself are at the National Gallery in London's Trafalgar Square looking at a wonderful exhibition called After Impressionism, Inventing Modern Art. The exhibition looks at artists and what happens to Impressionism in the 30 years leading up to the First World War, which started in 1914.
The curators have also attempted to include work made beyond Paris, showing the sort of flow of modernism into 4 other major European cities: Berlin, Barcelona, Brussels and Vienna. Here we have this wonderful painting by Picasso of a critic, Gustave Coquiot, who's an art critic in Paris, and it's painted in 1901 on one of Picasso's visits really to the centre of the art world before he actually moves in 1904. And here he's really sort of celebrating the personality and the charisma of this critic. So it borders on caricature. There's a satirical quality to the face, but nevertheless, you get such a strong impression of this man, this character, who is clearly a very influential writer at the heart of the avant-garde in Paris. And behind his head we have what appears to be a performance, or is it a painting? And Picasso's, playing with that uncertainty.
Already we can see real space and pictorial space and symbolic space kind of being much more confusing. And looking at a painting now is not about recording the real world, is it? And as you say, you're not sure whether the women in the background are painted. It's a poster. He's really sitting in front of a stage. It's very much Toulouse-Lautrec, isn't it? The kind of the nightclub. I find this person incredibly threatening and rather slimy, actually. I think this is a portrait of real power. He's right at the front of the picture plane, that kind of evening dress he's wearing with the crisp shirt and the tie. And his skin looks kind of slightly sweaty. I guess it's the limelight, isn't it, lighting his face.
I mean, there's a certain flamboyance to him. And Picasso, to some extent, is paying court to him and to his influence. Coquiot writes the introduction to Picasso's first Parisian catalogue. So clearly this is a man to pay respect to.
In many ways a traditional portrait of, as you say, his patron, but when we move down into the body, there's a real knocking out of detail, and we're moving excitingly into abstraction. And I was just going to mention that it's 50 years since Picasso's death, so in many ways really very current still.
I love this flourish here of the white cravat. I mean, there's some real drama in that thick impasto. It's just really sort of thickly applied to the chest there. And it helps to kind of act as a sort of shelf, really, to the face.
Brilliant painting, I love it. Tiny Van Gogh, which I'm not familiar with. It's a painting of a little seaside town which he travelled to. And it speaks to all of his interests in composition, in changing the way we look at the world, in texture, these fantastic pointed roofs with the verticals of the smoke coming out and that thick impasto paint. I'm loving that starburst foliage on the right-hand side. He's really playing with and pushing what traditional perspective might be. The colours are hyped up. This is about an emotional response to a place rather than a record of it.
These houses are like characters, aren't they, with their sort of different features. They've got this sort of distinct difference with the different roofs there and shapes. We've got a very deep perspective into the painting. And you were commenting on the foliage, it's like sort of bristling. They're almost like sea anemones, aren't they? But I think fundamentally what I take from this picture is this enjoyment and pleasure in Mediterranean colour that he really turns up in the painting. He's sort of freeing himself at this point from art historical convention and expectation. He is truly a kind of maverick, and he's going with his heart and his gut and just responding to this place and enjoying that moment of watching it and discovering it.
We have red roofs, blue roofs, and a yellow, a steaming yellow sky. It's fantastic.
So Klimt's extraordinary full-length portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer, one of his patrons, illustrates this sensuality in Klimt's painting. The way in which these surface details of flowers and pattern and this Chinese embroidered fabric behind her head really sort of brings the figure forward. But she's not an animated figure, is she? She's so still and passive. And what I'm drawn to is that slightly erotic open mouth. It's like a sort of adoration of her almost.
She's sort of Madonna, isn't she, in some way, a Madonna? You're looking up at her and as you say, she's got her lips parted and she has a halo, or actually a huge black brim of her hat. And she is, as you say, she's in front of the decoration, but she's kind of becoming part of it because she isn't animated. It's not about her physicality in a way. It's about those very simple shapes, those overlong arms, those kind of sloping shoulders, and she becomes part of the surface, part of the pattern making, which is incredibly beautiful. I mean, it's why we love Klimt, isn't it? It's that segue between sort of fine art painting and surface decoration.
The energy and sort of lusciousness and animation comes from the pattern, but she remains like this presence in the picture that is unavoidable. It's almost like she's carved from stone, like a sort of eternal figure.
And although a portrait of a particular person, I have to say, Klimt's women have a certain look about them. They always look like this, don't they?
I mean, you can tell he adores women, and I think he does respect them. We may disagree about that, but she was a patron. She hosted a salon in Vienna, and so she's a pivotal figure in the encouragement of the avant-garde and of modernism in Vienna.
Absolutely, and it has to be said there are many female patrons and they hold power. They have salons, they pay artists to make paintings, they commission works, and they're often called socialites. This is Joseph Brummer by Henri Rousseau. Brummer is a collector, a patron, kind of impresario, and a little bit like the Picasso portrait of his patron, it's about power. Rousseau was considered to be a naive painter, a primitive painter, and I don't think in any way we see that. I think he absolutely knew what he was doing, and they're actually very sophisticated portraits.
Yeah, it's an act of homage to this patron, and Brummer's depicted almost like a ruler or a king inside a throne, and the hands confident and the arms extend confidently over the armrests. And the cigarette is such an interesting detail. It's almost like an extension of his personality and of his body, and we can imagine him gesticulating with it.
It's about real power, isn't it? And Picasso was a great fan and at some point supporter of Rousseau and his painting.
We need to remember that Rousseau was not part of any art movement. He was an amateur painter. So he's developing this very distinct style and subject that is particular to his own sort of worldview and world experience. But looking at it, it's so strikingly modern. It's almost like a painting by David Hockney.
And they are, as you say, unique because he absolutely did his own thing. He took no advice. He didn't belong to any studio groups. He didn't really show with other people. He had, I think, a fractious relationship with the sort of formal art world, but was kind of eventually recognised.
And, you know, finally, your eye is drawn to this painting, and it intrigues me why. I mean, we can sort of speculate, but there is something so confident about it, so self-assured. And yet, he was sort of ironically so isolated, really, as an artist.
Young Finnish Woman by Sonia Delaunay is an intense, incredible, beautiful, kind of jewel-like little portrait. In many ways it's very conventional, it's just a portrait of somebody. But we again are looking at a departure from naturalism, a flattening of the surface, and a real joy, like Van Gogh, in colour. And she interestingly outlines the figure in black, which immediately flattens it out and takes form away.
You can see so clearly the influence of the Fauves, of André Derain, Henri Matisse, exhibiting from that famous exhibition of 1905 where colour went wild. It was illogical, it was just sort of instinctual, unmixed, straight from the tube and very sort of improvised. And we're left looking at a woman, it would be difficult to identify her. She becomes an archetype of a young woman. But nevertheless, you know, Delaunay has made something in this small size that has tremendous impact and power. And because it's cropped, think of, you know, modern photography techniques, we're in the space with her. It's very informal. 50 years before this, you would never have cut the head off anybody, but we're right in her space. So included in this room are works by German expressionists, including Carl Schmidt-Rottluff, who's affiliated with Die Brücke in Dresden, this notion of a bridge to the future. And Die Brücke comprised several young men, many of them trained as architects. And their work is very distinctive. It has this sort of vitality and energy. There's a sketchy quality to it. Again, very kind of responsive and immediate. And fundamentally, what you're looking at is this explosion of colour and brushwork that feels free and liberated from orthodox conventions and rules.
Absolutely. And we're looking at German Expressionism, aren't we? We're looking at the art, I suppose the centre, as it was called, of the art world being Paris for Europe. It's moving away from there. That power is dissipating, and places like Vienna and Berlin and Dresden are producing artists with a different aesthetic, and they're kind of pushing modernism in new directions.
It's a painting that clearly prioritises feeling and that kind of freedom of youth. I think that's important. And this is not recognizably a German landscape. It's hard to locate where it could be anywhere, really, because these colors are so hot, they're almost like sort of acid burning hot.
It's difficult, really, for us, isn't it, to look at a painting like this and realize just how radical they were. I mean, they were so radical, even compared to Impressionism, which by comparison seems quite quiet and polite, really, and at least still looking at, you know, naturalistic colours. As you say, this is just a painting on fire. André Derain's painting demands our attention. It's big, it's bold, it's in your face, it's called The Dance. No naturalistic colours at all, just this rhythm of figures crossing the canvas. And there are lots of cultural references. He's obviously looking outside of Europe. He's looking at, well, Romanesque statuary, he's looking at Javanese imagery, and crucially, the figure on the left here is based on a Fang mask that he owned from Gabon. So there's a lot of things going on here.
What strikes me about this painting is the symbolism of dancing, of movement, of energy, rhythm. There are innovations taking place in music, on stage, in art, and fundamentally there's this interest in the primitive, in inverted commas. And it's a term we wouldn't use today except in an art historical sense. But essentially, Derain and other artists like Picasso and Matisse are looking to artifacts brought from colonial possessions in Africa, Asia, and the Pacific for inspiration to sort of free them from dogmas about representation. And I'm just sort of really excited by this painting because it suggests a kind of universal energy that Derain is trying to tap into. And he's saying that, you know, these figures are free. They're free of sort of Western European inhibition.
For its time, it's a radical and liberal painting, isn't it? But as you point out, we're looking at it in a different way now. I'm fascinated by this incredibly frightening and large green serpent at the bottom, and I'm thinking Garden of Eden. It creeps into many, many paintings. But I think you're right, there is a real, again, and it was a radical painting, there's a sense of freedom, you can hear the music, and the figures making that fantastic kind of rhythm across the painting is really engaging.
There are serpentine motifs in this long dress, and a sense of flow through the picture of this rhythm, and also a kind of harmony with nature. You can see this bird, it's a little difficult to see. You can see the sort of outline of the wing there, almost like a sort of angelic wing in a Renaissance painting, but here in a very much in a sort of wild, almost tropical setting.
And I think for a lot of painters at this point, women are still associated with nature, with that kind of high emotion. So you often see this sort of motif, I suppose.
I mean, just to conclude, it's reminiscent of a frieze in stone in many ancient cultures, returning art to its very sort of early foundations.
This is Picasso's incredible and challenging painting of Fernand, his lover and partner for many years. It's a subject he tackled in sculpture as well, actually, trying to take a natural form towards Cubism. And paintings like this are very exciting because they have a foot in both camps, don't they? It's still a portrait, but he's pushing and pushing towards abstraction. So those smooth forms of the face and neck become harsh facets, almost as if they're made from metal, trying to push the human form into abstraction.
What we need to remember about Cubism is the way in which Braque and Picasso suggest there are multiple ways of looking at the still object or head or face. And to me, it's so reminiscent of film editing and of photography. This Cubist style speaks of new technologies of a new century, and philosophically proposes that artists can begin to quite literally break up the solid form so that it becomes really complicated and multifaceted.
It is fascinating, isn't it? I mean, it's a political act in a way to make a Cubist painting, because you are challenging all those dogmas of one viewpoint, one perspective, one correct way to look at the figure. And as you say, it owes a lot to filmmaking and photography. The idea that there's not a static viewpoint is really exciting, and it's freeing, it's liberating.
The other sort of radical act is to introduce notions of sculpture into a painting. But of course, historically, painters have attempted to create that illusion of three-dimensionality. That here he's reminding us of the potential of painting, while at the same time arresting that history by creating something that is so explicitly non-naturalistic.
This is a challenge to look at, isn't it? And in 1909, it must have been a huge challenge when you think of all those academic and salon paintings. You can't rest easy in front of this painting. You have to work. There are no assumptions. They're all blown out of the water. It's totally new and radical.
I'm drawn to these fruits because in a portrait that is so angular and bordering on the geometric, he's just allowed these rather voluptuous pears and peaches to sort of return to a sort of more rounded presence in the painting.
They take the place of the form of the body, don't they? Yeah, it's just a little nod to that kind of luscious shape.